Welcome to the First Gen American podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Toporek, and I'm a first-generation American. My dad was born in Siberia in 1942 and my mom in Turkey in 1943. I used to be ashamed and embarrassed that my family was different. We spoke different languages. We ate different foods. We were working class in an affluent area of Long Island, New York. In my 20s, through my awakening and journey of self-exploration, I realized how appreciative I needed to be given the sacrifice my parents made to give their children better opportunity. I realized that being first-generation American was more of a superpower than something to be ashamed of. Since then, I celebrated my background, harnessed these values into who I am today, embodying all these qualities into everything I do. In each episode, I'll be interviewing first-generation Americans, helping them tell their stories. I hope you enjoy the show. Please subscribe and like the show, and feel free to send comments or even interviewee suggestions. Thanks for listening. Known Rabbi Arnie Rachlis for over a decade. My family has been a part of that congregation since we moved to Orange County, and I was really excited to interview him. I actually never knew he was first-generation American until I reached out asking for assistance on who would be good people to interview. And it actually wasn't until Cantor Ruti, his wife, let me know that Arnie was first-generation American. So I'm really excited he got to spend the time with me and tell his story, which in this first episode we touch on many things, but we hear about the journey of his parents and how they came to the United States separately traveling here. We talk about his inspiration in becoming a rabbi, becoming a rebel, and actually identifying with Reconstructionist Judaism, his path on becoming a White House fellow and working in the State Department, working on Middle East peace, and his journey actually to the West Coast here in Orange County from Philadelphia to Evanston, and then finally here in Irvine. Really excited to share it with you. I hope you enjoy it. I learned so many things I never knew about him, and that's one of the favorite things I enjoy about doing the podcast, especially with people that I know, is learning about so many things I never knew before. So I hope you enjoy it, and we're recording part 2 in a couple of weeks, and I hope you tune in for that as well. Thank you.
When we just first started talking, it's interesting that you sort of made the assumption that I had known that you were first generation American, and you commented that, you sort of felt like everyone would do that. I've known you for such a long time, and, when I had sort of asked for help on, who would be good people to interview, you had left it out because you had assumed that I had known, right? If it wasn't for Cantor Ruti, we have to thank her, we wouldn't even be sitting here. So, because I would never have known.
Yeah, that's so interesting because, although I have to admit, in the 33 years that I've been a rabbi here, I don't think I've spoken autobiographically so often. It was mostly in this last year before I retired that I spoke more autobiographically. People have said to me, and I wasn't withholding, it was just, either I thought, or I thought maybe people weren't interested. Now, of course, I discovered that people are very interested, right?
Yeah. Well, what I find is that people make certain assumptions about what others know about them.
Yeah.
And it actually turns out to be, like when I interviewed my parents, 50% of the things that I found out from interviewing them, I had never known. Which is kind of staggering.
Yeah, it is, but it's really great with these first gen interviews.
So give us the background story of where were your parents from, when were they born, and how they traveled their way to ultimately get to Philadelphia.
Yeah. So my father was born in a little shtetl called Melnik outside Kiev. Well, they say outside, like 4 hours, but
right?
Because at that time Jews couldn't live in the big city, so they lived in what's called a pale settlement. Right? So this was an area extending from Poland into Ukraine, the border shifting all the time. So he, as a child, or teenager, was his mother. His father died when he was 2.
Mm-hmm.
So his mother paid a wagon driver to hide him in the back of the wagon, covered up with other agricultural things, and drove him across the border, where he then took a train to Hamburg to Germany. Again, teenager. There he got a ship, took him to New York, and from New York, just an hour and a half.
So what year is that he's
That was, yes, it was around 1912.
1912.
Yeah.
This is like anti-Semitism was happening. This is well before World War One.
Yeah, it's a little before World War One, before the Russian Revolution. Jews were being conscripted, right, by the Tsar's army. So parents wanted to get their children out, but it was an unusual way to pay a wagon driver, but not me. There were other parents who did this, and he had siblings who they got out in more conventional ways, because he was so young. His brothers were older, so they kind of maybe were in their late teens, early 20s. But he was young, but my grandmother had this feeling that, he would be conscripted. Oh, and you get conscripted for 25 years.
So what does conscripted mean?
Draft.
Okay, drafted
5 years. And basically
into the Russian.
So the Tsar's soldiers would come into villages and capture Jews, put them in the military for 25 years. So
it's interesting. I wonder if ultimately that's what happened to my grandfather.
for that reason.
Yeah. So did your father ever see his siblings, or?
Yeah, he thought, well, remember his mother got news too.
Right.
His mother survived. So he came here to Philadelphia. His brothers, one was in Philadelphia already, another one started in Philadelphia, went to Chicago and died in the flu epidemic in 1919. So he and his brother were the only two to get out and survive. Again, he had a few sisters, they did not get out, and some of the sisters died in jobbers, which was actually, pre-20th century, early 20th century, pretty common.
Right.
In rural areas of Eastern Europe. So he came here, Philadelphia. Do
you know why Philadelphia?
Yes, because his brother, a couple of years earlier, and it was a cousin. And in fact, the cousin brother lived in this area of West Philadelphia, a few blocks from each other, and then he joined like that, literally on the same block as his cousin. And he eventually brought his mother over in the early 1920s.
Okay.
Yeah. So, but he, being the youngest child here, was put in charge of taking care of his mother. So, he was a doctor. So he had a medical office on the first floor. He lived on the second floor, and his mother lived on the third floor.
So this is your dad?
This is my dad. Yeah, my dad was, and my mother was a doctor. So so he came here obviously without an education.
Right.
He was a yeshiva brother. He was a student of Jewish studies, so to speak, with no specific training except being educated. But so when he came to Philadelphia, didn't have money to medical. Sure. So he worked.
So he had to go to high school.
Yes. He finished high school here. Then he worked, so to speak, in a Spanish job, doing needlework and sewing.
Sure.
To make enough money to go to college. And then he became a pharmacist to make enough money to go to medical school.
So where did he go to college?
So he went to George Washington University for college.
Huh.
He went to Temple University for medical school.
Wow, so that's quite a journey for someone that, a literally from a wagon all the way through moving yourself through medical school.
Yes, and eventually he taught Temple University Medical School and acted in private practice. Was he? He was ear, nose,
Okay. Very handy.
Yeah. So, but he delayed getting married and having a child. I'm an only child.
Okay.
Because he was taking care of his mother.
Yeah.
He was very strictly Orthodox. She had 2 kitchens on that lot. 2 areas in the kitchen.
Wow.
She wore a shadel wig, She was, somewhat disapproving of my father's choices in who he went out with. He generally went out with people he met at the hospital, doctors, nurses, that kind of thing.
So was he observant or?
Well, he was raised to be observant, but no, I would say by the time he established himself in America and his mother came over, he was no longer observant.
Right.
You can imagine the tension.
Yeah.
Right. And it's all of those 3 parts, right? There's his profession, his personal life, his mother.
Did he own the building?
He owned the building. Yeah.
Wow.
And I was born in that building. After he married my mother, we moved away at about 3 to a very Jewish neighborhood. That in a Jewish neighborhood, by the time I was, when you think of it, he bought that building like in the late 1920s. So I was born in 49. So it was no longer really a Jewish neighborhood. So when he had a child, it was time to move.
Right.
My mother was from Vienna, very different background. She was, there's a term in Hebrew, maskil, means an enlightened Jew, meaning she went to the University of Vienna, studied English literature, then she went to medical school at the University of Vienna. This is a little bit like Freud,
Mm-hmm.
and literally she lived, about a mile from University of Vienna medical school. How I know this, I have been to my mother's apartment in Vienna, still standing. And I have been to my father's village in Melnik, in Ukraine.
Wow.
So, and I took my chance. I wanted them to say, where their grandparents were from. Now, my mother's parents were killed in the Holocaust.
Mm-hmm.
And she was also an only child. But 33 of her family members were including her parents.
So, all right, let's wrap our head around that. So when she goes to medical school,
Because
how does that even happen as a Jew in Vienna?
well, until she went to medical school in the early to mid 1980s. Vienna was invaded in 38, and so she was able to complete. She was going to be a psychiatrist.
Okay.
But she finished her medical school. She wanted to continue. The Nazis came in. She knew she had to leave. And it's a really interesting story about how she left. But so she never got to be a psychiatrist. She was a general practitioner. Later she took an exam here in America, became a family practitioner, which is similar, but she wanted to be a specialist. She, for decades and decades and decades, she felt that was taken away from her. And she was one of the oldest people to ever take the family practice exam. She took it like when she was in her 70s.
Oh,
yeah. Because this was
it was really important.
Yeah.
So how did she get out and none of her family members?
Yeah. Well, her parents were born in Poland, and the visas to go to the United States were based on where you were born, not where you were living. Mm-hmm. So they were living in Vienna. And her father was in the oil business. So when I was growing up, she told me her father's in the oil business. I thought, like Texas oil. That was the olive oil. So saying olive oil from Italy to Vienna. And he, she came from this masculine, enlightened Jewish background, very cultured. And you can imagine, in the 30s. Very cultured. As a child, her father took her to synagogue every Friday night to listen to the cantor.
Mm-hmm.
Because in those days, rabbis had a different role. It was more halachic, they interpreted Jewish law,
right?
Or they gave sermons like
sure.
So the cantor, and they had these virtuoso cantors, like they did in New York, in the early 20th century. So people flocked to synagogue, not out of piety, but to hear the cantor, to be with other Jews.
Well, the synagogues were built for those acoustics.
And they were.
Yeah.
So, and, when on Kristallnacht, when all the synagogues and Jewish businesses were burned, her synagogue that she grew up in, I visited, still standing. The reason is it's a synagogue built between other buildings on the block, with common walls, and businesses around the synagogue were not owned by Jews, as Nazis didn't burn the synagogue because they didn't want to burn the businesses of the other Viennese citizens. So it was really the only synagogue in Vienna that survived the war. So she was in a very educated background, culturally, in the sense of the center of European society. And my father came from the shtetl background. And they were fixed up by a doctor in common that they knew. Of course, they had a lot in common on one level.
So let's go back and talk about how your mom got here.
Okay.
Because in 1938, she's done with her doctorate.
Yeah.
And now, it's go time.
So her parents, as a school, couldn't get out. And they died during the Holocaust because they were born in Poland. She, which was born in Vienna, was on the American quota for Austria. However, so were tens of thousands of other Jews.
Sure.
So the Yiddish mind, things like the JCC, Jewish Community Center, the Yiddish mind had phone books of major cities in America, and they invited Jews who wanted to leave to come in and look at those phone books and find a name. My mother's name was Glansberg, to find another Glansberg, and that they would help her and these other Jews write, mostly telling, they would wire those families in the United States and say, will you provide an affidavit for this Viennese Jew saying that you are related to them? And most of these Jews in America were not related, let's be sure, but they wanted to save their fellow Jews. And so my mother had actually 3 or 4 people competing for her. You know what I mean? In New York, in Philadelphia, a few other places, Boston, people who had the same Glansberg, not a common Jewish name, but, it has that Berg at the end.
Sure.
Right. So other Glansbergs signed those papers and she got out. The day before she left, she had her ticket, her boat ticket, and all her paperwork. The Nazis actually came to her apartment. She lived with her parents, as unmarried women did as it, and they confiscated some of the documents. But my mother wisely had copied the documents out there, knowing that this could happen. And so it was like they thought.
It's not like they had copy machines.
No, I don't play as stenographer. Those those things.
Yeah, the printing machine.
That's pretty much it. So she got out. But what happened?
She left her parents and siblings behind.
She left many siblings, but
cousins, right?
And some cousins were in Germany, some were in Austria, and until December 7th, 1941, until Pearl Harbor Day, you could have correspondence with your relatives in Europe or in Europe. But once war was declared between the United States and Nazis, all mail stopped. So she couldn't send money to her family. She couldn't write to her mother. And I have these letters that she wrote to the State Department, to FDR, President Roosevelt, to the Joint Distribution Committee, to
find the information.
They were so inundated with similar requests. And the government was not very flexible. They wanted to limit the number of Jews. So, for her, it was like the walls were closing. And, at least my father got his mother out and, had his mother alive for much of it. He was born in 1896. She died in 1942. So, it's like 50 years roughly you've had her on your mother. But my mother, at the age of, early 30s, late 20s actually, my mother full.
Yeah, she goes along.
Yeah. So, anyway, so they, as I said, they met by being fixed up. And my mother lived in a little town called Norristown, up in Philadelphia. And of course, she moved toward my father, who was living in Philadelphia, but she still commuted every day to her office in Norristown, which, a California commute, it's like nothing.
Right.
But in those days, to drive 25 minutes to work every day was like, how can you do that? It's so far, So,
let's get to, they meet, they start to have you as a family.
Right.
Describe what it was like growing up, in Philadelphia, where, both of your parents, I'm guessing they had accents.
Yeah, of course.
Right. So,
but I'm sure this is the case with you too. You don't hear your parents. That's the way they just talk.
Yeah. And actually, this comes up in almost every interview, that when you're like in middle school, some of your friends ask you like, well, where's your parents' accent from? What are you talking about? So you're like, you could hear that, you could hear everybody else's accent.
It's true. Yes, it's true. And I was, after my father died, he left like a cassette tape, or maybe it was a small tape in those days. And so he died. I was like 11 years old. So years later, listening to that tape, maybe 10 years later, I was like shocked to hear his accent.
Oh,
really? Because really, I never, even in my head, I don't think of him with the accent.
Sure.
So, anyways, yes, they met me. We moved to Winfield, it's the name of the neighborhood. Winfield was kind of like, you're from Long Island, right? Yeah. So, the five tail.
Right.
So,
which I never admit I'm actually from. It just happens to be where I'm from. Which makes this worse.
Well, so this was the last city neighborhood before the suburbs, before Lower Merion. Yes. So anyway, it was such a Jewish neighborhood, and I attribute my becoming a rabbi to living in that neighborhood and things that happened as a result of living in that neighborhood, because public school in Philadelphia were closed to Jewish holidays, which and even when they weren't Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, right, they were closed. But on the holidays that are major for the Jewish community, but not for like an American, suppose or something, nobody went to school. And so even though public schools were open, my elementary school was about 80% Jewish.
Oh, wow.
I went to public schools. As I got older, my schools decreased in Jewish population because it was a wider demographic area. But still, my high school, Central High School, which we would call a charter school today, right?
Right.
When I meet people and I tell them I'm from Philadelphia, sometimes they're not, and they say to go to Central High. Because it was like Bronx State School of Science, or one of those where like all the Jewish kids lived in the area. So, and I commuted an hour each day, three buses or one bus and two subways to go there. But that's, that was the Jewish ethos in those days. You're going to get the best education you can.
So were most of that's a very common thing.
Yeah.
My parents moved to five towns because, they bought whatever they could because that was the best education that we were going to get access to.
Yeah.
So it sounds like the community that you grew up in was mostly pretty Jewish, but were they American Jews, or were there a lot more people that were actually first generation?
I would think the parents of my friends were mostly American born.
Okay.
Interestingly enough, my father's patients, so my father had an office in the old building, where he lived with his mother until she died. He kept that office until he died. But he also had an office in our home, which was also not unusual for doctors there, where the first half of the first floor was the office, and then the rest of the house.
Growing up, my doctors and dentists, that was the side.
So Many of the patients, not most, many had access, were immigrants. But they, you know, I think they felt comfortable as an immigrant doctor, right? And they're probably Russian or Ukrainian Jews. So, my mother, whose office was in Norristown, right? She had mostly Italian and African American patients because, there was no Jewish neighborhood in Norristown, right? Synagogue, but it was really an Italian community. And I'll just say an interesting story. I hear this story. I heard it from one of my mother's friends. My mother lived to age 90. So she's not 20 years ago, so maybe 5 years before that. She told me this story that as the neighborhood got riskier for days, she said she could have moved like other doctors did to the suburbs of Norristown. But she really liked being a doctor to the population that she started. And she was the doctor for children, parents, and their granddads. And it's like from the 1940s, so she was about 30 then. Until she was in her 80s, she practiced out in that neighborhood. And the story here was people or other doctors were trying to convince her, move your practice to, something like 2 miles away in the south. And, she said, I know a lot of friends. And they said, this drug dealing going on in the corner, violence. And this person from this said, the gangs protected my mother.
Because she was serving the community, and she's untouchable.
Exactly.
Everybody, she could walk the streets freely. No one ever going to.
Don't touch the dog. Was
right.
Don't touch
them. Makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. So
she got a lot of joy of
and she was a real social activist. So this a lot the side of me. My father was more politically conservative. I mean, I wouldn't call it conservative. I call it maybe today it'd be like middle of the road or something. But my mother, because of this experience she had with the Nazis, I think, of seeing, 6 million just to be wiped out and 33 of her family members, and the pain of being, my father was dislocated when he was a teenager. My mother was like the cusp of finishing her profession in this amazing city in Europe. And she was a real civil rights activist. She was, in my whole growing up, the person who had respect for African Americans more than anyone, more than any teacher, more than any rabbi, it was just like in her DNA, her culture.
She identified.
Yes, exactly.
How they were being oppressed.
Absolutely right. I'll tell you one story. When she built a carpool to junior high school, and with a she was driving, and this was the neighborhood was starting to have some African American families in the neighborhood, and as we're driving, kid in the back seat, I remember this story too. Said, "Oh my God, Netflix, the insurance, for Negro, what?" My mother stopped the car, and she pulled over, and she said to this kid, "If I ever hear you say that again, you are going to walk to school." And yet I was a child, embarrassed in that moment. But a year or so later, when I kind of came to consciousness myself about these things, I realized it was like a heroic moment. It taught me.
What's amazing that it only took you a year to get to that point, because a lot of first generation Americans, they don't really appreciate where they came from or wherever it is until much later on in life. And for me, it didn't happen until really college. I started to do a little bit, but really after I graduated, I was actually working, and I took a step back and really understood, wow, that was much more of a superpower than I ever realized, then that's something I should ever be embarrassed about.
Yeah, absolutely. When you're a teenager, you're embarrassed by anything your parents do that where your friends will not like you because of what they said. But it's one of these networks that is like so formative in my social activist outlook. Anyway, so
what was it like? Did you face any adversity being from parents, or did you have any embarrassment, or it was easy for you to kind of embrace?
my father's first name was Port, like Aruch. It's an unusual name, and we had a shingle outside, the front door, being on the street. We walk past the house, where's Rachlis in me? And the kid said, "What kind of name is that? Birch? What is that?" And he said,
And
"Right." And I remember being a little embarrassed at that. It's the only moment I really recall, because my parents were very respectful of the name, both doctors, and because our house, our house was 2 doors from the synagogue, with the church in between. So our house, the Presbyterian church, and Harzine Temple, the synagogue. And this was the Harzine Temple was like Wilshire Boulevard Temple. It was like this thousands of families, and it took up a whole square block of gymnasium, had a baseball field of block. But I mean, it's the synagogues
where the community gathered.
It's really,
and they were the first us.
We were poor. We would come over to our house in the afternoon to rest.
Right.
We didn't serve food, but we, people would like lie in our sofas, because they wanted to take a break from service. So
that's a very different perspective, because you were in a community that was predominantly Jewish.
Yeah.
So very accepting. And your parents were like really a big part of the community itself.
They were.
Proximity to the synagogue. And yeah, I mean, it sounds like you were able to really embrace it and harness it at a young age.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I say the trajectory of living in that neighborhood and everything that went along with it didn't make becoming a rabbi inevitable, but it helped enable it, because the synagogue was the major institution in the neighborhood. There were a couple smaller synagogues. This was a big conservative synagogue. It was a little Reform synagogue, Orthodox synagogue also a little, but this was like, the big synagogue. And that's where my friends went. And that's where, when I went there for junior congregation on Sunday mornings, my parents didn't go to synagogue very much for service. So, Friday nights we stayed home, and we rarely had Shabbat dinner. We had a quasi kosher home, meaning we didn't have, pork, bacon, shellfish.
Right.
We didn't have kosher meat. My mother didn't like Shabbat candles.
Oh, interesting.
So I didn't come from a ritual home. I came from a Zionist home. My father was the president of medical division of Histadrut. Histadrut is the labor Zionism.
Mm-hmm.
So, we had kind of my mother's social activism and my father's Zionism, and we were very culturally Jewish art on the walls, Jewish books on the shelf. So, and then they sent me to thanks. My mother sent me to Camp Ramah.
Okay.
I was in summer camp. I was involved with USY, the youth group, and that.
And part of that is because your friends from the community were probably going too, and so it's kind of part of what.
It's a thing you do.
Yeah,
it's true.
So now let's go through your college experience. You never went very far from
No.
So even though cheesesteaks aren't kosher, there must be a reason why you stuck around and being close to your mom.
I think, it's like my father with his mother, I mean, he felt this obligation to take care of her, and that was his position in the family, by being the youngest. Well, I was the only, my mother was widowed. And while, some of my friends went to New York, Chicago and other places for college. You know, I don't think I ever thought to not go to Penn. You know, it's sort of like if I could get it.
Well, it's not like Penn's a state school, so
Yeah,
pretty well. And so you went to Penn undergrad,
right.
And so what did you major in?
English literature.
English literature.
But my mother in Vienna, but I don't think I knew she studied English literature in Vienna at the time. But I was always a reader.
Right.
And my mother was always a reader. So I think, so, but I really think when I think about it, I mean, I must have applied to other schools.
Sure.
I don't remember ever thinking, you know, I thought if I don't get into Penn, I'll go to Temple or something like that. You know?
Right.
So I studied English literature, and
did you know what you wanted to do after college?
Certainly being a rabbi, it's not on the list.
Right.
It's not interesting. I was going to be a doctor when I entered college because my parents are doctors. And you know, when I said to my mother that I was going to become a rabbi, she's joking, but maybe not completely joking. You know, my mother is a rabbi and a doctor.
That's a joke.
So, no, when I went in, I was going to be a doctor because that was kind of like the family profession. And then, by the time I put biology and chemistry, and then this wasn't interesting. And then, well, then I'm going to be a lawyer because it's kind of like the pecking order in my mind was doctor, lawyer,
right?
You know, PhD, psychologist. You know, I could see who, say, my mother.
It's usually doctor, lawyer, banker.
Yeah. Well, there were not a lot of Jewish bankers then.
That's very interesting.
Yeah. In fact, there were not a lot of Jewish CEOs when I was growing up, you know.
And it's funny because for me, it was doctor, which was never going to happen. And then lawyer, which I was supposed to go to law school. And then my senior year, I actually said, there's no chance I can do this. And then vaulted to banker.
So it's interesting. So, you know, I don't know if you know the name Irving Shapiro. Irving Shapiro became the CEO of DuPont.
Mm-hmm.
DuPont, of course,
yeah,
major corporation. He was the first Jewish CEO. This is in my, I don't know what year, you know, in the 60s maybe. That's how infrequently Jews were CEOs or bankers or, I mean, it was a very different world.
Right.
You
know? Go to Penn, you get your literature degree,
right.
And so then what do you do?
So then I decided about like late junior, early senior year to go to either rabbinical school or to a PhD program, Brandeis in Jewish Studies.
So you knew at some point in college,
you know, let's say late junior year, I had a professor named Bob Seltzer at Penn, but Jewish Studies. He is still alive.
Wow.
He's 90 years old. I had lunch with him in New York. He lives here. I had lunch with him in New York 5-6 years ago. I mean, he also changed my life because he said to me, you know, he was first ordained as a rabbi, then he PhD in Confucius. Said, I was never a very good rabbi, but you would make a good rabbi. He kind of planted that interesting idea in my head. And so that's not the only thing that happened. But
so why did you feel like you wanted to become a rabbi? What was the path that you saw that you found? Because some people go the rabbinical route because they want to, you know, they want to help people, or they want to do the academic version of being a rabbi.
Yeah.
But what was it that attracted you to wanting to do that?
When I was a sophomore, I took a job as a USY advisor, youth group advisor, at Philadelphia synagogue. And I enjoyed it so much. I didn't think I took it just because I had certain skill set. You know, I knew Hebrew and I knew a lot about Judaism just from my Jewish education. And I took it, but I discovered that I really felt very, I don't know, I felt like it was an important thing to do. And I felt empowered by it. And then so then I went, and I spent the summer following, like, summer before after my junior year studying Talmud. So it started, certainly it wasn't there in my freshman year, but it started in my sophomore year. But again, not thinking I was going to be a rabbi. In fact, I resisted the idea of being a rabbi because nobody became a rabbi in 1970. I went to rabbinical school in 1970. I remember Jerry Bernstein. Okay, I remember his name. This is how vivid it is. In the library at Penn, Jerry Bernstein, of course, like so many of us, had long hair and a beard.
Yeah, it's the 70s.
He wore a cape. I still in the library. So what do you do after graduation? I said, I'm going to go to rabbinical school. Why? I said, I'm going to go to rabbinical school. He said, why are you wasting your life?
Interesting.
Yeah, that was typical. That was something typical people would say to you if you said, I'm going to go to rabbinical school. Other people became doctors or lawyers or became stained glass, window makers, or became forestry. And, people were dropping out of the norm that, rebelling. And this was like a very conventional thing, not a usual thing, but like going to rabbinical school. And we got religious out. Right. So I went to Israel that summer and I worked in a kibbutz, and I was reluctant to tell the people at the kibbutz what I was going to do when I got back. I said, I'm going to go into Jewish education, or I'm going to go to graduate school. Really, because the reaction I got from Israelis was the same thing.
Yeah, why would you waste your time?
Right. So I remember sitting on the beach in Tel Aviv and thinking, can I really go back and go to rabbinical school? I had these those kind of moments as well as pivotal moments. But I have to say, within a few weeks of being at this place.
So, rabbinical school, you went to
the Reconstructionist rabbinical college. Okay. Also in Philadelphia.
Yeah, of course.
Had a Temple University graduate school at the same time.
Okay, so I need to understand, based on how you were brought up, there's so many different, paths that you could take from rabbinical school, from Orthodox to Reform, and, at least from what I know about Reconstructionism, probably was relatively new.
So, very new.
So how did you even, because honestly, when we moved to Orange County, I never even heard about that sort of branch of Judaism.
Yeah, there's only one in Long Island.
Really?
One Reconstruction synagogue in Long Island. I can't remember the name of the town. Roslyn. I think it was Roslyn. It made us move from Roslyn to another town, but at that time it was Roslyn. And no, there weren't many at all. And I grew up conservative, as I said. And I went to my pulpit, the rabbi I grew up with, and I asked him, he said, don't go to the Reconstruction, go to GTS, go to the Conservative Center.
Yeah, that's where most people who really want to become.
Or they go to the Reform Center.
Right.
Conservative Reform Centers are very big, right? Although the newest report is that each incoming class at the Reform and Conservative Center is fewer than 10 people.
Oh, wow.
I mean, the rabbinate, when I went, there were maybe, oh my God, can you imagine, 150 people becoming rabbis each year. Now we're talking about, 10 at Reform, 10 at Conservative, about 7 at the Reconstructionist, and then there's an independent Jewish center. We're talking about 50 people graduating a year from all non-Orthodox centers.
Right.
So, but I was very Seltzer, the teacher at Penn, taught a class on Mordechai Kaplan, the founder of Reconstructionism. And that's a big part of why I thought I could become a rabbi, because I was a religious humanist. I was very comfortable and proud being Jewish. That was not ever a problem. But I just had difficulty with the traditional belief of God. That God heals the sick, parts the sea, watches over us and intervenes in history. So the more humanistic view of the Reconstructionists made me throw caution to the wind, really, because, if I wanted to guarantee a career, and a job, I would have gone to the Reform Conservative Center.
Right.
Because they had zillions of jobs. The Reconstructionists, when I went, had no graduates yet. I was in the third class of a 5-year graduate program.
Wow.
So I went in without any assurance that I would ever have a job.
Right.
But again, the spirit of the late 60s, because it was, we were all somewhat unconventional. I can't exactly explain it, but like being a rebel was like a good thing.
Yeah. I mean, it sounds like that fit what your spirit was kind of telling you, which is, I do want to become a rabbi, but I have to do it in a way that my soul believes.
Yes.
So that I have conviction over it.
Yes.
And I think, if you do anything like that, it develops a passion for it. And it's not just a job. And you've clearly been able to attract people to want to be around you and your version of the humanistic form of what you described is probably the first time I've heard that, but it makes a lot of sense.
Well, you put it so well. I should be interviewing you. But honestly, it allowed me to bring together this very rich Jewishness they had, which included my parents being immigrants who had to leave because they were Jewish,
and the social activism, and the history, because so often we have a Torah from the Holocaust.
Yes.
And, every time you mention it with such incredible deep meaning that it's funny that I never put it together of like why you felt so connected to it. But that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So, I'm starting to get this very clear picture of, not only why you went down the path of rabbinical school, but how you actually chose like an unknown part of it, because it's what resonated most with you. Exactly. But also incorporating who you were from your experience of being in Philadelphia, being from immigrant parents.
Yeah. 100% right. There's a Jewish philosopher named Emil Feckin. He passed away a long time ago. But he said how in Jewish tradition there's 613 commandments, according to Jewish tradition. He said the 614th commandment is not to give Hitler a posthumous victory. And I think that's a big part of it, that they're just not going to kill us. I'm going to be around. I'm not saying it's the only motivation. Sometimes I mention Fackenheim's statement, and they feel I'm reducing my Jewish identity. No. But part of my Jewish identity is that, I'm Yisrael. The Jewish people live. We're going to live. We're going to thrive. Not just survive. We're going to have a big impact on the world. We're going to comfort each other like one big family. And a lot, that feeling of saving Jews in every way, getting them out of the former Soviet Union. That's another chapter in history, like travel in the Soviet Union, sneaking things in and sneaking things out. But so much, of my commitment to being Jewish was formed because I'm a first generation. I'm saying to my parents, you don't have to worry. I take care not just of you and our family, but take care of the Jewish people. It sounds grandiose, but I don't mean it.
It's not grandiose, actually, because it happens with, people's actions one at a time.
Yes.
It's one of the reasons why I finally felt really compelled to do the podcast, which is, it's important to honor what my parents did for me. And now I want to help people tell their stories so that, it's important to hear, especially in the environment and the world that we live in. The stories are empowering, not just for Jews, or it's for anyone who is coming to this country with opportunity. And there's a certain DNA that is ingrained in almost every first generation American, that partially comes from like, you've got no safety net, right? Like you've got to figure it out. You've got to do it in a way that is going to have a big impact.
And I feel that I'm richer emotionally because I'm a first generation American, because I like being kind of a hyphenated, an American Jew, a American Jew first generation, and of course, my contemporaries, like even asking for like the kids in the neighborhood, they had, American born parents. But I always felt it was a little different, not in a negative way,
Just different.
yeah, just different.
Different languages spoken in your home,
Yeah.
different accents, there's different food being made.
Oh, all my parents' friends were immigrants. I didn't know
My parents,
Yeah.
I mean, my parents, when I was growing up, if they wanted to go out, which they didn't go out very often, I mean, they would go to a Russian nightclub. And I would be with them. I'd be 12 years old, but I'm like, what is going on here? It was just terrible. None of my other friends were going to Russian nightclubs. So it was very clever. Most of them have no idea that I probably even did that.
Yeah, that's actually fascinating. I'm thinking like we had a New Year's party at home, or Thanksgiving, or whatever it might be. Everybody had accents.
Yeah.
Everybody was from either Vienna, either from Austria, Germany, or Eastern.
Interesting.
And there was one guy, Morris Friedman, my parents' lawyer, who was the American part. He was the ally.
He don't want to be. He wanted to be an immigrant. Okay, so you go to rabbinical school, you finish rabbinical school, you have no idea if that's going to lead to, the prospect of getting placed in a synagogue. How does that even work, and where did you go?
Yes, so every movement has, a jobs network, or whatever you want to call it, place in Europe. So, and this happens in VTS and HUC and the other seminaries. You start as maybe a third-year student going to a pulpit somewhere, either assisting a rabbi, like going like once a month or whatever it is, just for Shabbat meeting, or the synagogue doesn't have a rabbi; it's small. So I started going to this pulpit in Evanston, the suburb of Chicago, and they didn't have a rabbi. And, it's kind of a natural development that I went there every month or every other month. Other rabbinical students were going there as well. But I kind of hit it off with them, and they hit it off with me. And when I was ready to graduate, they offered me a position.
That's great.
And I stayed there for 15 years. And,
Finally got out to Philadelphia.
Yeah. Oh, and I thought I was going to go for like 2 or 3 years, because once to leave the East Coast was kind of nice, Yeah,
but something, being in Evanston especially, it's such a charming neighborhood. Being in a university where you're around other academics and being part of
just like here, I went from Evanston to Irvine.
Yeah.
I went to an academic community. But this Reconstruction synagogues are usually in major cities or college towns.
Oh, interesting.
Usually college suburban towns, not like, in the middle of Wyoming. But so, this synagogue, when I came here, was very much like my synagogue in Evanston. It was certainly a different part of the country, but people, in the case of Chicago, Evanston, many people grew up in the Midwest.
Right.
Here, everybody grew up somewhere else.
So Evanston for 15 years.
Yes.
And this is,
76 to 91. And then when I was a White House fellow in 85, 86, I worked at the White House. I'm a Democrat. It's a bipartisan program. Worked in the Reagan administration. Worked on Middle East peace issues.
So how does that even work, where you're a rabbi, but then you're also a fellow? Like,
don't you take that? So I went to Washington for a year, and you go through it's a long process. You have to get interviewed. You have to write 30-page application or something. You get interviewed regionally in Chicago, and then you get interviewed It wasn't a presidential retreat. It wasn't Camp David. It was a different one, but in like a rural retreat for 4 days where they like watch.
4 days.
It's really intense. I mean, the one in Chicago was a night and the next day, actually, because, Forum's right now, right?
Yeah.
The interview in Chicago was an Erev Purim. The evening was the dinner was, and then you have the whole next day of interviews. Okay. I said I can't come in the evening for dinner. And, I told them why. And I said, oh my God, they're going to jeopardize my chances. But I can't not be there for Purim. And then I remember trying to explain to Purim once to them. You don't understand. They pronounce it Purim. So they never was right. I don't get how to explain Purim. It's like too much writing. So they said, no, we understand. We respect your religious needs. And so I was at a disadvantage visiting from in the evening. I went the next day. I got passed through to the next level, which was the national one. And then you get interviewed at different cabinet posts with cabinet secretaries and my staff to see where you're going to fit in, because I had this interest in, Israel and Middle East, certain skills. The State Department working on Middle East peace, which obviously I failed at, along with everybody else for the last 75 years. So, anyway, when I took that year off, I went to the Capitol. I was invited by the White House. Do you remember the name? Natan Sharansky. He was being honored by Congress. So you have Tip O'Neill, who's like a giant, and Sharansky was quite short. And so I walk into the rotunda, and I see an empty seat, and I sit down. I sit down next to this couple from Newport Beach, California, a place I've never been. I've been to LA. Hal and Hinda Burrell, founders of the Civic Arts. And that dance meeting was like, it's a share, It's like, I sat down next to them, talked. We saw each other the next night by coincidence at a Jewish event. Yeah, the American Jewish Committee was having a convention. So I went to, honor the director of the committee at the next night, and the girls were there again. And they said, will you come out to our little Havurah? It's now meeting in living rooms in Newport Beach and speak to them about Reconstructionism, about being White House fellow. So I said, sure. And they said, when are you going to be in the LA area? And I said, no, in 6 months I have a conference there. And it was like this spring.
So at this point, did you have family already?
Yeah.
So you moved your family to Washington for the year?
Yeah. And then but I have to say, being a White House fellow helped dislodge me. Even though I loved the United States.
Right.
It made me think I could do a chapter too. Yeah. And
you were young enough.
I was young. Yeah. This really came along at the right time frame. I was already before I was in Washington. But when I came back for a few years, I was ready. I didn't know where to go. I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do. I was offered some Jewish organization jobs. I was offered some jobs in Washington, but it was like, not quite right. And then I met these people. I met the Burrells, and I met this Havurah, and his families or something. And they were saying, are you insane? You're living in a synagogue with 600 families in Evanston, and you're going to come to Southern California? So I didn't do that.
Yeah, actually, have you seen the weather on the palm trees?
But I took a chance, and I'm not such a risk taker, but I took a chance.
So you took a chance on going Reconstructionism to begin with. You took a chance becoming a rabbi.
Yeah.
I mean, if you continue listening to your gut, things generally fall into place.
It's very true. So I'm, of course, very happy I moved here. There's no question about it. But I hope I didn't talk to you.
No. Because you know what? Thanks for listening to the First Gen American podcast. I hope you enjoyed the show. Feel free to leave your comment and make sure to smash the subscribe button.